My neighbor was standing in my driveway, holding my barefoot toddler when I got home. And my front door was still wide open. I'm Vera. I had just gotten back from my night shift at 9:12 p.m., and my phone was blowing up with missed calls I hadn't seen while driving. My son Micah was shaking, crying so hard he could barely breathe, clutching his stuffed dinosaur like he'd been outside for hours. But my babysitter, Sabine, was still inside my house. Netflix was blasting from the living room. There were snacks on the couch. And when I called her screaming, asking why my 2-year-old was locked outside alone in the dark, she actually sounded annoyed. She said he wouldn't stop crying, I needed quiet. Then my neighbor interrupted and said, "Vera, there's something else you need to see." Because it turned out Sabine hadn't just ignored my son that night, she'd been recording the whole thing. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Mrs. Delaney handed me her phone with both hands like she was afraid I might drop it. The video was grainy doorbell footage from across the driveway, but I could still see Sabine clearly. She opened my front door, looked around, then stepped onto the porch carrying Micah on her hip, while he cried against her shoulder. At first I thought maybe she was trying to calm him down. But then she set him down outside and walked back in alone. I felt my stomach drop so fast I actually grabbed the hood of my car to steady myself. "No," I remember whispering, "No, no, no." Mrs. Delaney's voice shook. "I saw him sitting near the bushes about 30 minutes ago. I thought maybe she was right behind him, but then I kept hearing him cry." Micah buried his face into my neck while I stared at the screen. The timestamp in the corner said 8:31 p.m. That meant my 2-year-old had been outside by himself for over 40 minutes. In the dark, barefoot, and the whole time Sabine had been texting me updates. I pulled up our messages with shaking hands. 8:34 p.m, Micah finally calmed down. 8:41 p.m, photo of his blanket on the couch. 8:47 p.m, he's getting sleepy lol. Every single message had been sent while he was outside crying. I stormed into the house holding Micah against my chest. The TV volume was so loud it rattled the living room windows. Sabine was sprawled across my couch under my blanket, staring at the screen like nothing had happened. She barely looked up when I walked in. "What is wrong with you?" I screamed. She rolled her eyes. Actually rolled her eyes at me. "I told you," she said, "he wouldn't stop." Then she reached for the remote and paused Netflix like I was the one interrupting her night. That's when I noticed something else. My child safety chain was locked from the inside. Micah never could have opened that door himself. And Sabine saw me looking at it. For the first time all night, her expression changed. Sabine stood up so fast the couch cushion slammed back into place behind her. For a second, neither of us said anything. Micah was still clinging to my shoulder, sniffling into my sweatshirt while I stared at the locked safety chain on the door. My brain kept trying to force another explanation into place. Maybe she panicked. Maybe she thought fresh air would calm him down. But none of those excuses explained why she locked the chain afterward. "You put him out there," I said quietly. Sabine crossed her arms immediately, defensive, cold. "I didn't leave him outside that long." Mrs. Delaney was still standing in the doorway behind me. "That baby was crying for a long time," she snapped. "I almost called the police myself." Sabine's face tightened for half a second before she looked back at me. "You act like I abandoned him," she muttered. "I was checking on him." I looked around the living room again. The half-eaten popcorn, the soda can sweating onto my coffee table, the giant glowing Netflix screen paused in the middle of some crime documentary. Nothing about this looked like someone checking on a crying toddler. It looked like someone trying to ignore one. And suddenly all the little things from the past few months started hitting me at once. The headphones she always wore around Micah. The way she called toddlers tiny dictators. The times she complained that he cried too much when I worked late. I had ignored every red flag because I needed help. Sabine grabbed her purse off the couch. "Honestly, Vera, you're overreacting." Then Mrs. Delaney said, "You should check your cameras." Sabine froze. Not dramatically, just enough. But I saw it. And the second I did, I pulled out my phone and opened my security app. Most of the footage from that night was gone. Deleted. Except for one short clip. I pressed play. The camera showed my front hallway. Micah stood near the door crying with his little dinosaur in his hand, while Sabine sat on the couch off screen. Then her voice cut through the speaker. "If you don't stop crying," she warned, "you can stay out there." A second later, the front door opened, and the video ended the moment it slammed shut. Sabine lunged forward and said, "Wait, don't watch that again." "Don't touch my phone," I snapped, pulling it back against my chest. Sabine stopped in the middle of the living room, her face flushed now, not embarrassed, not guilty, angry. Like she was the one being attacked. Micah started crying again the second her voice got louder, and he buried himself deeper into my shoulder. I could actually feel his body shaking against me. Mrs. Delaney stepped between us. "You need to leave," she said sharply. Sabine laughed once under her breath. "Seriously, over one clip?" "One clip," I repeated. "My son was outside alone." "He was fine." That word hit me harder than yelling would have. Fine. Like 40 minutes alone in the dark was normal. Like my 2-year-old sobbing in the cold was an inconvenience instead of a child. I told Sabine to get out before I called the police. She stared at me for another second, then grabbed her purse and headed for the door. But before leaving, she turned back and said something that made my stomach twist. "You should probably calm down before you start accusing people of abuse." Then she walked out. I barely slept that night. Micah woke up screaming twice after midnight, terrified every time I tried to put him down. By morning, his feet were red and scraped from the concrete near the driveway, and he felt unusually cold. So I took him to urgent care. The nurse checking him over kept glancing between me and the chart with this careful expression on her face. Finally, she asked quietly, "How long was he outside by himself?" I told her the truth. Everything. And 10 minutes later, 2 police officers walked into the exam room. My chest tightened instantly, but then one of them said, "Ma'am, we need to ask about your babysitter." Apparently, Sabine had already called them herself earlier that morning. And according to her version of the story, Micah had wandered outside alone because my house wasn't secure. She told them I was panicking to cover my own negligence. I was still trying to process that when Mrs. Delaney texted me another video file. Doorbell footage. Longer this time. And right before I opened it, the detective beside me suddenly leaned closer to the screen and said, "Hold on, what's in her hand?" The detective replayed the footage 3 times. Sabine stepped out onto my porch holding Micah with one arm while balancing her phone in the other hand. At first, it looked normal, but when the detective zoomed in on the reflection in my front window, my stomach dropped. Her phone camera was facing her. She wasn't texting. She was recording herself. The detective paused the frame. "Can you send this to me?" I nodded automatically, barely hearing him anymore. Because suddenly everything about the night felt different. This wasn't a frustrated babysitter making one horrible decision in the moment. She had been performing. Later that afternoon, after Micah finally fell asleep beside me on the couch, I called Sabine. I didn't even know what I planned to say. I just needed to hear how she explained any of this. She answered on the second ring. "What now?" she said flatly. I put her on speaker. "Why were you filming?" There was a pause. Then she sighed dramatically. "Oh my God, are you serious? You locked my child outside." He was crying non-stop, Vera. I couldn't hear anything. The TV was loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "That's not the point." Her voice stayed weirdly calm the entire time, like we were arguing over spilled coffee instead of my son being abandoned outside. Then she said something that made the entire room go cold. "Parents these days act like crying is abuse." I stared at the phone in disbelief. And that's when another officer called me back. They had found Sabine's social media accounts. Not her normal ones, hidden ones. private livestream clips, short videos, hundreds of followers. Most of the content was her joking about babysitting, mocking dramatic toddlers, complaining about crying kids. And in one recovered livestream from the night before, Micah's voice could be heard crying in the background while Sabine laughed at comments on screen. One comment read, "Girl, why is that baby screaming like that?" Another said, "Wait, is he outside?" She ignored both. Then the detective told me something even worse. Other parents had started calling in after seeing her name. And one of them claimed Sabine had locked her daughter in a bathroom during a babysitting shift because she needed a break. I was still staring at the screen when my phone buzzed again. A new text from Sabine. "Please don't ruin my life over this." By that evening, the police had recovered the full cloud backup from my security system. Sabine had deleted the footage from the app on my phone, but she either didn't know or forgot that the original recordings still uploaded automatically online. I sat in a small interview room at the station with a detective beside me while the video loaded. I almost told him I couldn't watch it, but I did anyway. The timestamp started at 8:24 p.m. Micah was standing in the hallway crying for me, while Sabine sat on my couch scrolling through Netflix. Every few seconds, she glanced toward him with this exhausted, irritated expression, like he was ruining her evening. "Come here," she muttered finally. He walked over, reaching for her. She picked him up, bounced him once against her hip, then looked directly into her phone camera and said, "Okay, I literally cannot hear anything right now." The detective paused the video. She was live streaming there. I nodded slowly. He hit play again. Sabine carried Micah to the front door while still talking to her viewers. He started crying harder the second she opened it. Then she stepped outside, set him down barefoot on the porch, and walked back in. No hesitation, no panic, no checking on him afterward. She shut the door, latched the child's safety chain, turned up the TV volume, and went back to her live stream. I broke down right there in the station. Not loudly, I just covered my mouth because the worst part wasn't even seeing her lock him out. It was watching Micah afterward. He knocked on the door with both hands at first. Then he sat down crying. Then he stood back up and tried the handle again. Over and over. For 43 minutes. At one point, Mrs. Delaney's voice could faintly be heard outside yelling, "Sweetheart, where's your mommy?" The detective stopped the footage. He didn't need to show me the rest. Sabine was arrested the next morning for child endangerment and reckless neglect. And once investigators started digging deeper, everything around her unraveled fast. Other parents came forward. One mother said her son became terrified whenever she left him with sitters after spending a weekend with Sabine months earlier. Another claimed Sabine regularly wore noise-cancelling headphones while children cried in the next room. The woman who originally recommended her to me showed up at my apartment crying. She kept apologizing over and over, saying she never knew. Meanwhile, Sabine tried defending herself online. That lasted less than a day. Once the security footage leaked, public opinion flipped instantly. Her accounts disappeared almost overnight. Brands she'd been contacting for sponsorships cut ties before she'd even officially built a following. But honestly, none of that mattered to me compared to what happened inside my own house afterward. Micah wouldn't sleep alone for nearly 2 weeks. Every night he'd wake up crying if I left the room for even a minute. Sometimes he'd grab my wrist in his sleep just to make sure I was still there. So I stopped taking extra night shifts. I installed new cameras, changed my locks, and for a long time, I blamed myself for trusting the wrong person just because I was tired and needed help. Then about a month later, I got one final text from an unknown number. I said I was sorry. I stared at it for a second. Then I deleted it. Because the last thing Sabine ever wanted was silence. Now it's all she has.